Pope Innocent III. In July 1209, at Béziers, in Languedoc, the Crusader host assembled outside the city walls, while the town's defenders and residents remained inside a confined urban space with limited exits. The involved parties were the northern French Crusaders operating under papal legates, and the population of Béziers under the nominal authority of local lords linked to the wider conflict branded as the Albigensian Crusade. Contemporary estimates for the attacking force vary widely, commonly framed in the tens of thousands, while the town held several thousand people, including refugees. Retreat and surrender options narrowed quickly because the Crusaders demanded the handover of alleged heretics, and the city's leadership could not easily separate those accused from the rest without internal collapse. Once violence began at the gates and the outer defenses were breached, the dense streets and buildings created choke points. Reinforcement from Allied powers was not immediately available, and the town's mixed population complicated any organized evacuation. As the assault spread, conditions worsened through fire, disorder, and crowding. The fighting ceased to resemble a controlled siege and became an uncontrolled killing across multiple sites. The decisive phase came when resistance broke, and large groups were trapped in churches and narrow lanes, where no disciplined withdrawal could be organized. Reported deaths in narratives range from several thousand up to far higher figures. Historians treat the largest totals as rhetorical, but agree on extreme loss of life. Béziers' destruction hardened the Crusades' reputation and accelerated the wider conquest of Languedoc, reshaping regional power in favor of northern lords and papal policy. Peter I of Russia, from late 1698 into 1699, in Moscow and nearby sites of confinement, the Russian state moved against the Streltsy regiments after their revolt. The opposing parties were the Streltsy units, previously central to Moscow's military order, and the Tsar's government directed by Peter I and his commanders. The scale involved several regiments and thousands of soldiers and dependents, with arrests extending into broader networks suspected of support. Escape routes were limited because the Streltsy were intercepted, disarmed, and brought under guard before any coordinated flight could occur. Many were held in prisons or temporary stockades, with interrogations conducted through formal investigations. Command authority rested with Peter and appointed officials, who treated the revolt as both a military threat and a political challenge to central rule. The action began with trials and interrogations that escalated into mass sentencing. Over time, the pressure intensified through repeated questioning, public punishments, and the spreading net of arrests. The environment of Moscow in winter, with overcrowded detention and fear of further uprisings, compounded the collapse of any organized resistance. The decisive phase was the implementation of executions and deportations, carried out as public displays of state power. Estimates for those executed vary in the sources, commonly in the hundreds to over 1,000, with many more exiled or forced into labor. The consequences were long-term. The Streltsy as a political military actor was broken, and the state's coercive apparatus expanded, clearing institutional space for Peter's army reforms and a more centralized autocracy. Simeon I of Bulgaria. In 904, at Thessalonica on the Aegean coast, a major urban center faced attack during a period of rivalry between the Byzantine Empire and the Bulgarian realm. The involved forces were the city's population and garrison under Byzantine authority, and the raiders who entered the city in the broader context of regional warfare and opportunistic assaults. The leadership framework placed Byzantine officials in local command, while the wider strategic environment was shaped by Simeon I's rise and Byzantine instability. The city's capacity to retreat was constrained by its walls and the dependence of civilians on staying within defenses. Once the attackers gained access, evacuation was limited by narrow gates, panic, and the rapid spread of violence. Reinforcements from Constantinople could not arrive instantly, and maritime escape was neither orderly nor assured when the port was threatened. The action unfolded as an assault that turned into seizure and looting, with captives taken in large numbers. Pressure intensified as neighborhoods were stripped of resources and people were rounded up, disrupting any remaining command. The decisive phase came when organized defense failed and the city could not prevent mass enslavement. Sources report tens of thousands taken captive, though exact numbers are debated. The event is nevertheless treated as a catastrophic blow. Thessalonica's losses weakened Byzantine confidence and contributed to shifting balances in the Balkans. The long-term consequence was a sharper militarization of frontier policy and a deepened cycle of raids, retaliation, and population displacement that marked the region for decades. King George III. In August 1814, in Washington City, in the United States, British forces entered a lightly defended capital during the War of 1812. The parties were British expeditionary troops and naval support operating under command authority in the North American theater, and American militia and government institutions attempting to defend a small, partially built city. British strength is usually placed in several thousand for the landing in advance, while American defenders were scattered and unevenly trained. Retreat and reinforcement were constrained because the American line collapsed after defeat at Bladensburg, leaving the capital exposed. The geography of roads leading into the city allowed rapid entry, and the American government evacuated, removing much of the command structure. Surrender was not formally negotiated in a way that could protect public buildings, and local forces lacked capacity to reform a defensive perimeter quickly. The action began with the occupation and systematic burning of key government structures, including the Capitol and the Executive Mansion, framed by British command as retaliation and strategic demonstration. Conditions escalated as fire spread, records and supplies were destroyed, and the city's limited infrastructure made containment impossible. Psychological pressure intensified because the capital's symbolic value exceeded its military defenses. The decisive phase occurred as British units completed targeted destruction and withdrew before American counterattack could assemble. Casualty figures in the city itself were limited compared to major battles, but material loss was extensive and the shock was profound. Long-term consequences included a hardened American commitment to coastal defense, the rebuilding of federal institutions, and the war's transformation into a contest shaped by morale, symbolism, and national legitimacy. Moctezuma II. In May 1520, within the ceremonial precincts of Tenochtitlan in the Basin of Mexico, Spanish troops and their indigenous allies confronted the Mexica elite during a tense occupation. The parties were the occupying Spaniards under Hernán Cortés's captains, and Mexican nobles and warriors connected to Moctezuma II's court during a religious festival. Numerical estimates vary, but Spanish accounts indicate a small Spanish force with allied auxiliaries facing a much larger city population capable of mobilizing thousands. Retreat was limited because the Spaniards were lodged within the palace complex and depended on causeways for exit, which could be cut. The city's lake geography restricted routes, and the Mexica could isolate the occupiers by controlling bridges and channels. Reinforcements were not immediately available to the Spanish garrison, and the political legitimacy of the occupation was already eroding. The action began when Spanish forces attacked within a confined space, triggering wider revolt. Pressure escalated as the city's factions turned hostile. Provisions tightened, and the Spaniards became trapped behind barricades. The environment of dense urban canals and rooftops allowed continuous harassment, while command cohesion among occupiers deteriorated under constant assault. The decisive phase followed in the attempted breakout that later culminated in the disaster of the night retreat, with heavy Spanish and Allied losses. Casualty estimates remain contested. Many Mexican nobles and participants were killed in the initial violence, while the Spanish later suffered hundreds of deaths and large losses of equipment during withdrawal. The consequences were enduring. The breach destroyed any possibility of stable coexistence and accelerated the cycle leading to the siege and fall of Tenochtitlan, transforming imperial authority across Mesoamerica. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, in late 82 BCE and into 81 BCE, in Rome and across Italian municipalities, the political order collapsed into organized violence under Sulla's dictatorship. The parties were Sulla's victorious forces and allied political factions against the defeated Marian networks, senators, equestrians, and local elites targeted for elimination. The scale involved thousands of names circulating in public lists, with armed men enforcing seizures and killings. Command structure rested on Sulla as dictator, with agents and supporters implementing prescriptions at multiple sites. Escape was limited because the lists criminalized individuals publicly, making travel dangerous and shelter uncertain. Property confiscation funded rewards, turning private citizens into informants and hunters. Many targets were trapped by family ties, debt, or the need to protect dependents, while local authorities complied to avoid suspicion or punishment. Reinforcement for the proscribed did not exist. The state itself had become the mechanism of pursuit. The action began with formal publication of names and authorization of killing without trial. Pressure escalated as new names were added, widening the circle beyond immediate political enemies. The fear of denunciation reshaped daily movement and fractured patronage networks. The decisive phase came when confiscations were completed and offices were refilled with loyalists, turning terror into institutional redesign. Ancient sources give varying totals, commonly in the thousands killed and many more dispossessed. The consequences were structural. Precedent for legalized political murder entered Roman public life. Wealth and land redistributed into new hands, and the republic's norms weakened, enabling later cycles of civil war and autocratic power. Philip II of Spain. Between 1558 and 1562, in Valladolid and Seville, Spanish royal and ecclesiastical authorities prosecuted alleged Protestant and heterodox circles through the Inquisition. The involved parties were inquisitorial tribunals supported by royal policy under Philip II, and networks of suspects drawn from clergy, merchants, and households. The scale was significant at the local level, involving dozens of principal defendants and wider circles of investigation, numbering into the hundreds through denunciations and interrogations. Command authority lay in the tribunals and their officials, with ultimate political support from the crown. Escape was constrained by surveillance, informant systems, and the legal structure that allowed secret testimony and prolonged detention. Suspects were frequently held incommunicado, limiting coordination or flight. Reinforcement from foreign Protestant powers was impossible, in practical terms, and local sympathizers risked becoming suspects themselves if they offered shelter. The actions began with arrests, seizure of books, and interrogation procedures designed to map networks. Pressure escalated through successive rounds of accusations, the fear of implication, and the tribunal's capacity to detain without public disclosure of evidence. The decisive phase arrived at the autos de fe, where sentences were announced publicly and punishments implemented, including execution in some cases. Numbers executed in these clusters were limited compared to later mass atrocities, but the broader impact was extensive. The prosecutions reinforced confessional uniformity in Spain, constrained intellectual and religious pluralism, and aligned state power with a coercive religious apparatus that shaped Spanish society and imperial governance for generations. Emperor Qinzong, from late 1126 into early 1127, at Kaifeng in northern China, the Jurchen Jin forces encircled the Song capital during the Jingkang crisis. The parties were the Jin army under its commanders and the northern Song court and defenders under Emperor Qinzong and senior officials. Estimates for Jin troop strength vary by source, but the besieging force was large enough to sustain encirclement and repeated assaults, while Kaifeng held a vast civilian population and a garrison strained by supply shortages. Retreat was nearly impossible because Kaifeng's walls enclosed a dense metropolis, and the court's political structure depended on remaining at the capital. Reinforcements were limited by divided command, contested strategy, and the Jin ability to disrupt communications. Negotiated surrender attempts produced temporary pauses but did not restore strategic freedom, and the city's resources depleted under blockade pressure. The crisis began with siege operations and diplomatic demands that forced internal factional conflict. Conditions escalated as food scarcity spread, soldiers' morale deteriorated, and the court attempted desperate mobilizations and payments. The decisive phase came when the Jin breached control through renewed attack and coerced capitulation, then imposed systematic seizure of people and valuables. Losses included large-scale plunder and the deportation of the emperor, the retired emperor, and many members of the imperial household and court. Exact numbers taken are debated, but were substantial. The consequences were immediate and lasting. The northern Song ended. The southern Song reconstituted further south, and the political geography of China shifted toward prolonged north-south division and new frontier militarization. Philip III of Spain, between 1609 and 1614, across Valencia, Aragon, and Castile, the Spanish monarchy executed the expulsion of the Moriscos, descendants of Muslims forcibly converted to Christianity. The parties were royal administrators and armed escorts acting under Philip III's decrees, and Morisco communities ordered to depart under threat of force. The scale was vast, commonly estimated at roughly 300,000 people expelled, with regional variations. Command structure involved royal councils, local officials, and military units tasked with control of ports, roads, and staging areas. Escape and reinforcement options were minimal because the state regulated movement and assembled communities for transport. Many faced confiscation, limits on what could be carried, and exposure to violence by bandits or hostile locals. Maritime departure concentrated people at ports where crowding, disease, and shortages intensified, while inland routes were policed to prevent dispersal or hiding at scale. The action began with proclamations and compulsory assembly, followed by forced marches and embarkations. Pressure escalated as families were separated, property disputes erupted, and ships carried overcrowded passengers to North Africa or other destinations under uncertain reception. The decisive phase came when the last large convoys left, and royal power treated resistance as treason, enabling arrests, killings, and enslavement in some localized episodes. Deaths during the process cannot be counted precisely and vary by region and circumstance, but suffering and loss were severe. Long-term consequences included demographic and economic disruption in expelled regions, intensified confessional uniformity, and a legacy of coerced migration that reshaped Spain's social structure and Mediterranean relations. Kirti Sri Rajasinha, in 1817 to 1818, in the central highlands of Sri Lanka around Kandy, British colonial forces moved to suppress the Uva Welasa rebellion in territory recently annexed from the Kandyan kingdom. The involved parties were British troops and local auxiliaries under colonial command, and Kandyan rebels tied to local chiefs and networks claiming loyalty to the deposed royal order associated with Kirti Sri Rajasinha's dynasty legacy. The scale included thousands of combatants and non-combatants affected through village reprisals and supply denial operations. Retreat was constrained by mountainous terrain, narrow passes, and the dependence of rural communities on fixed agriculture. Rebels could disperse, but civilians could not relocate entire harvest systems, making them vulnerable to destruction. Reinforcement for rebels was limited because external allies could not easily enter the highlands under British patrols, and British control of administrative centers disrupted coordination among chiefs. The campaign began with patrols, punitive expeditions, and efforts to cut off food and shelter. Pressure escalated as villages were burned, crops destroyed, and suspected supporters punished. Environmental conditions in the highlands, combined with forced displacement, intensified hunger and disease risks. The decisive phase came when organized rebel leadership was captured or killed, and the British imposed legal penalties and land controls to prevent renewed mobilization. Casualty and mortality figures are difficult to quantify, with deaths resulting from direct violence and from famine-like conditions caused by devastation. The consequence was the consolidation of colonial authority, a restructuring of land and governance in the highlands, and a long-term rupture in local autonomy that shaped Sri Lanka's 19th century political economy. Holy Roman Emperor II. On May 20th, 1631, in Magdeburg, on the Elbe River in the Holy Roman Empire, an Imperial and Catholic League army stormed a major Protestant stronghold during the 30 Years' War. The parties were the besieging imperial forces under Johann Tserclaes, Count of Tilly, with subordinate commanders, and the city's defenders aligned with Protestant cause and local leadership. Attacker strength is generally placed in the tens of thousands. The city held a smaller garrison and a civilian population, possibly around 20,000 to 30,000 before the siege, with numbers fluctuating. Retreat was limited because Magdeburg was encircled and relied on its walls and river access, both constrained under siege. Reinforcements promised by Protestant allies did not arrive in time, and supply shortages grew. Surrender negotiations failed to produce secure terms, leaving defenders and civilians trapped between continuing siege pressure and fear of reprisals. The assault began with a breach and rapid entry. Conditions escalated into widespread fires and loss of command control as soldiers dispersed for looting. The decisive phase came when the city's defensive structure collapsed and large sections burned, making organized resistance and evacuation impossible. The outcome was catastrophic destruction. Deaths are estimated in the tens of thousands, though exact totals are debated. Many perished from killing, fire, and suffocation. The sack's consequences were strategic and psychological. It altered diplomatic calculations, intensified fear across German territories, and became a turning point in how populations understood the war's capacity for urban annihilation. Ivan IV of Russia. In January and February 1570, in Novgorod and nearby monasteries and settlements, the Tsarist court launched a punitive campaign against a major Russian city suspected of disloyalty. The parties were Ivan IV's Oprichnina forces and supporting troops under centralized command, and the city's clergy, merchants, officials, and residents. The scale involved thousands of armed men entering a winter-bound city, with seizures and executions extending across social strata. Escape was constrained by season, geography, and state control of routes. Frozen rivers and roads did not guarantee safety when patrols operated outside the city, and families could not easily abandon property without exposing themselves to arrest. Reinforcement was impossible because the state itself was the attacker, and neighboring powers could not intervene quickly within Muscovy's interior. The action began with arrests, accusations, and confiscations, followed by mass killings reported in chronicles and later accounts. Pressure escalated through prolonged terror, starvation risk caused by seizure of supplies, and the targeting of institutions such as monasteries that normally offered refuge. The decisive phase came when the campaign reached its peak intensity, after which the forces withdrew, leaving a shattered civic order. Death estimates vary widely in sources and later historiography, from several thousand to much higher numbers. Scholars treat exact totals cautiously while recognizing a major demographic and economic blow. The consequences included the weakening of Novgorod's autonomy and commerce, consolidation of coercive central power, and a precedent for state violence against urban centers that resonated through later Russian governance. Aliya, Rama, Raya. On 26 January 1565, near Talikota in the Deccan region of South India, the Vijayanagara Empire's army faced a coalition of Deccan sultanates. The parties were Vijayanagara forces directed by Aliya, Rama, Raya, and senior commanders, and the combined armies of Bijapur, Ahmadnagar, Golconda, and Bidar under their respective leadership. Estimates for army sizes vary considerably across sources, often framed in tens of thousands on each side, with significant cavalry and artillery present. Retreat became difficult because the battle unfolded on open ground where cohesion mattered, and Vijayanagara's command depended heavily on a small leadership corps. Once betrayal or defection narratives appear in sources, the key historical point remains that command collapse occurred rapidly. Reinforcement was not available mid-battle, and the imperial army's formation could not easily reconstitute once broken. The engagement began with standard battle maneuvers and artillery exchanges, then shifted into intense close combat. Pressure escalated as units lost alignment and the coalition exploited gaps. The decisive phase arrived when Rama Raya was captured and killed, producing immediate disarray. The army's collapse turned into a rout. Casualties are not precisely countable. Chroniclers describe heavy losses. The outcome was the subsequent sack and destruction of Vijayanagara's capital, with extensive killing, looting, and displacement. Long-term consequences included the fragmentation of imperial authority in the Deccan, the rise of regional polities, and a lasting reordering of South Indian political geography and urban networks. Queen Mary I of England, in February 1554, in London at the Tower and nearby execution sites, the Tudor government moved to eliminate leadership associated with the attempted elevation of Lady Jane Grey and the later Wyatt's Rebellion. The parties were the Crown under Queen Mary I and her council, and rebel leaders and implicated nobles, including Thomas Wyatt and figures linked to earlier succession maneuvers. The scale involved several thousand rebels mobilized, with key leadership captured and tried. The decisive actions focused on a smaller group of elite prisoners. Escape was limited because the rebels failed to secure the city and their routes were blocked. Once detained, prisoners were held within fortified custody, with legal proceedings controlled by the Crown. Reinforcement from sympathetic factions was constrained by rapid royal mobilization, the loyalty of key institutions, and the political risk of renewed uprising under heavy surveillance. The campaign began with trials for treason, supported by confessions and evidence collected during suppression. Pressure escalated as the government sought to deter further instability during a contested marriage and succession environment. The decisive phase came with executions of principal leaders and, in the most politically charged instance, the execution of Lady Jane Grey, who had been used as a figurehead in the succession crisis. Numbers executed were limited compared to mass killings elsewhere, but the political consequences were disproportionate. The suppression strengthened Mary's short-term security while deepening confessional polarization. It narrowed the space for compromise and intensified the linkage between succession politics and religious allegiance that shaped England's later crises under Elizabeth I and beyond.